On the creaking deck of the Creole, in the cold and restless November of 1841, the Atlantic wind howled with relentless fury, battering the wooden planks and carrying with it the ominous rattle of iron chains. Beneath the deck, in a darkness so complete it swallowed hope, 134 men and women huddled together, bound and trembling, condemned to the merciless grip of the slave markets of New Orleans. And yet, amid the suffocating despair, one man's spirit refused to be crushed: Madison Washington. As night fell over the rolling waves, he and a handful of determined comrades rose. In a surge of courage that defied centuries of oppression, they seized the ship from the very hands that sought to enslave them, turning fear into rebellion, despair into audacity. Days later, 128 souls would step onto foreign soil, not as cargo, not as property, but as free human beings, their chains shattered, their dignity reclaimed. Madison Washington's life began, like so many others of his generation in Virginia, under the crushing weight of iron and tobacco leaves. He was born into bondage. His first cries were not his own, already claimed on another man's ledger. The plantation field stretched endlessly in precise, unforgiving rows of green tobacco, each stalk whispering the inescapable truth. This was a world where bodies belonged to masters, and freedom was only a distant rumor. For young Madison, each row was a corridor of oppression. Each season, a relentless reminder that his body was not his own, and each sun-scorched Sunday an echo of the chains that bound him. And yet, even in the midst of toil, freedom whispered. Madison listened, drawn to the stories of elders who spoke of lands beyond rivers, of voices that could not be silenced, of skies that belonged to no one. To most, these were comforting tales, meant only to soften the sting of bondage. But to Madison, they were promises. He grew into a man both tall and lean, admired for his formidable strength, yet remembered most for his unyielding resolve. Behind quiet, watchful eyes raged a storm, a tempest fueled by generations of stolen liberty. And within that storm, the memory of wings, a vision of flight, of escape, of life beyond chains, refused to fade. When he finally broke free, it was as if the storm had finally erupted. He ran northward, every step a rebellion against the world that had sought to own him. Every night beneath the vast indifferent stars, a whispered prayer for survival. Against the impossible, he crossed into Canada, where the air was no longer shackled by ownership, where labor brought reward, not sale, where breath itself was his own. Yet one man's freedom could not fill the hollow of his heart. Madison's wife remained behind, still ensnared in Virginia's soil. Liberty without her was incomplete, a song without its chorus. And so, the man who had tasted the sky chose to descend once more into the cage of mortal peril. He returned south, risking all for love. The price was steep, captured again, dragged back into the unforgiving world of chains. His daring escape became a story whispered among captives, proof that defiance was possible, and a caution that freedom carried its own peril. He was like a bird that had felt the wind, that had seen the horizon without bars. To be forced back into confinement after touching the heavens was a torment beyond imagination. And yet the fire within Madison Washington refused to die. It smoldered quietly, ready to flare again, poised to turn despair into defiance when the time came. The Creole was never meant to carry human beings. It was built for profit. In November of 1841, 134 enslaved men and women were crammed aboard, shackled and bruised, their bodies pressed into a hold that smelled of rust, sweat, and fear. Above deck, the ocean stretched endlessly, indifferent, merciless, each wave a reminder of the futility of escape. Among the captives sat Madison Washington, confined in body but unbroken in mind. He gazed through the narrow grates carved into the wooden walls, glimpsing the horizon that seemed to mock him with its freedom. To the sailors, the ocean was merely a road for trade and commerce. To Madison, it was something more, a vast blue expanse, a living embodiment of liberty, tantalizingly close yet held forever out of reach by iron shackles. Days bled into nights as the waves rolled on, but within him, the resolve only deepened. Days blurred into one another, each marked by the same grueling routines. The ration of stale, hard bread, the oppressive thud of boots above, the relentless clank of chains whenever a body shifted in discomfort. In that suffocating darkness, time seemed to stretch and suspend itself, as though the Creole floated not only between ports, but on a threshold between life and death itself. To the merchants, these men and women were mere cargo, numbers to be tallied, investments whose value would be realized in the bustling squares of New Orleans. Yet the human spirit has a stubborn way of defying arithmetic. Every whispered prayer, every fleeting glance exchanged between captives became a quiet act of rebellion. Madison Washington, leaning with his back against the creaking hull, began to mold that silence into resolve. He had known freedom once. He had breathed the air of liberty. That memory, delicate as it was, became a spark, a tiny flame pushing against the oppressive darkness that threatened to smother all hope. The vast, endless ocean seemed both mocking and inviting. To sailors, it was a road for commerce and trade. To Madison, it was a living, breathing emblem of what life could be. Blue, limitless, unreachable, but undeniably real. The horizon itself seemed to murmur a promise. Chains are not destiny. As the Creole pitched and groaned, Madison observed every detail. He noted the fatigue in the guards, the rhythm of the sailors' movements, the rare lapses in vigilance. He understood that freedom would not be given. It would have to be claimed, seized, fought for. While others lay in despair, his mind moved with precision and purpose. Deep within him, he carried a knowledge both terrifying and exhilarating. The journey of the Creole would not end as the merchants intended. Something, either the chains or the men who bore them, would break before this voyage concluded. The lower deck of the ship was a world of shadows. Lanterns swung weakly, casting trembling halos of light that only deepened the surrounding darkness. The rattle of iron on wood was a constant soundtrack, blending with the acrid scent of damp timber, sweat, and fear. To most, it was a dungeon drifting on the waves, a place designed to crush hope. Yet in that oppressive silence, voices began to rise, softly at first, almost imperceptibly, like threads of light weaving through the gloom. It was Madison who sparked them. His voice, calm but resolute, threaded its way through the darkness. He leaned close to one man, then another, letting his words fall like sparks upon dry grass. He spoke of timing, of patience, of waiting for the moment when the guards would tire, when vigilance faltered. He spoke of courage, of reclaiming what had been stolen by chains. Some listened in fear, shaking their heads. Revolt was dangerous, a whisper of death in the making. Yet others leaned closer, eyes glinting in the dim lantern light, drawn to the unshakable conviction in Madison's tone. He did not speak as a dreamer. He spoke as a man who had once breathed free air. "We may not all live to see it," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "But we must not die in silence. Better to rise and fall as men than to sink forever as cargo." A plan began to form in fragments. One would watch the guards, another would conceal whatever could be wielded as a weapon. Iron bolts were loosened from the hull. Shards of wood, sharpened and hidden, became instruments of potential liberation. They would not act as 134 individuals, but as one body united in its hunger for freedom. In those plodding hours, the air of the hold shifted. It thickened not with despair, but with anticipation, crackling with the fragile electricity of people daring to imagine a different fate. Chains still bound their wrists, but the idea of liberty began to loosen the heaviest shackles of all, those encasing the spirit. Whispers became their covenant, every glance and nod in the darkness a promise. They would not end in the markets of New Orleans. If death came, it would come on their own terms. And if freedom was to be grasped, it would be seized with hands unflinching and hearts unyielding. Seized, they would grasp it with every ounce of strength they possessed. For the first time since stepping onto the Creole, Madison felt the very air shift. It was as though the ship itself recognized the storm gathering in its belly. Above, the Atlantic thundered endlessly, waves pounding like drums of fate. Below, a tide of men and women surged in silent agreement. Tonight would belong not to despair, but to defiance. It was the night of November 7th, 1841. The darkness was heavy with salt and expectation. On deck, sailors moved in weary, predictable rhythm, their boots striking the planks, voices swallowed by the wind. Below, the captives lay still, feigning submission, but their eyes burned with alertness. They had counted the hours, measured the moments with precision, and now the hour had come. Madison Washington rose from the shadows, tall even within the cramped hold, his figure a calm storm in the darkness. No grand speech escaped his lips, no rallying cry. A single nod, measured and deliberate, was all it took, and like a match struck against stone, the revolt ignited. Chains clattered to the floor, iron striking wood in a sound that seemed almost ceremonial, like a bell tolling freedom. Men lunged forward, fists clutching splintered wood, iron fragments, whatever could serve as a weapon. The confined space of the ship became a tempest. Merchants fell under the sudden fury. Sailors scrambled, their shouts and curses mixing with the sharp crack of splintering wood, the scrape of metal on timber, and the ragged gasps of men caught in desperation. Then, as abruptly as it began, silence descended, broken only by the slap of waves against the hull. On the deck above, the surviving sailors, stunned and outnumbered, were forced into submission. Some lay wounded, others bound in the very chains meant for the enslaved. The revolt had cost blood, but it had been swift, precise, and overwhelming. The Creole was no longer a vessel of commerce, a floating warehouse for human misery. It now answered to those it had once imprisoned. For Madison Washington, the moment was not triumph, but resolve. His chest heaved, sweat mingling with the salty air, yet his voice rang clear across the deck. This ship no longer belongs to despair. It belongs to us. The men and women around him did not see a master, nor did they seek one. They saw a beacon, a living proof that hope could take form, that courage could strike flesh and bone. They had lit the spark. Now they had to keep the fire alive. Above, the stars wheeled silently across the night sky, distant witnesses to a rebellion that would echo far beyond the Atlantic. Below, in the quiet that followed, every heartbeat shared the same unspoken truth. The voyage of the Creole had changed course forever. The ship groaned as its timbers adjusted to a new command. The rebellion had claimed the vessel, but freedom, as Madison knew, could not simply be declared. It had to be navigated. The surviving sailors, hands bound and eyes wide with fear, were the reluctant instruments of a new order. They knew the sea, knew the currents, but they no longer held the power to dictate the ship's fate. Under the steady guidance of Madison and his allies, the bow was turned eastward, away from New Orleans, away from the markets of human suffering, toward the uncharted and unknown. The wheel groaned as it shifted, wood against wood, rope against rope, a subtle but profound sound for those who understood. It was more than a change of direction. It was the axis of destiny itself, pivoting under the hands of the once enslaved. The flag of the United States rippled overhead, a symbol of the very power that had claimed them as property. Yet beneath that same flag, a new kind of nation was emerging, not defined by borders or laws, but by defiance, by the courage to claim life when all forces had sought to deny it. The men and women clustered together, whispering quietly, planning their next moves, hearts still racing with the thrill and terror of what they had achieved. Prayers whispered and trembling voices clung to one another as the Creole adjusted her new course. Some wept openly, tears streaking faces etched with exhaustion and relief. Others simply closed their eyes, imagining the shore that waited somewhere beyond the horizon, a promise of liberty painted against the vast Atlantic. Yet fear lingered. The ocean was no friend. Storms could rise without warning, tearing at sails and pitching the deck with merciless force. Naval ships could appear, enforcing laws that denied their freedom, dragging them back to chains. Even the subdued sailors, bound and fearful, could still betray them with miscalculated bearings, leaving every moment balanced on the edge of trust and terror. Through it all, Madison Washington remained a pillar of resolve. He stood firm at the stern, moving among his companions to steady trembling hands, gripping shoulders, offering quiet reassurance that transcended the roar of the wind. His voice, carried by shouts over the tumult, radiated calm authority. "We have begun. We cannot go back." Each wave that crashed upon the deck was more than water. It was doubt, fear, and despair, seeking to drag them beneath the surface. Yet with every surge, Madison's determination only grew clearer. "Storms pass," he reminded them, "but chains endure forever. If we surrender now, our fate is sealed in iron. If we endure, the horizon may yet hold freedom." Hours, or perhaps an eternity, passed as the storm raged on. Time lost all meaning, replaced by the relentless roar of wind and water, the deck heaving like the chest of some giant leviathan. Then, as dawn began to edge the horizon, the clouds slowly parted, spilling a thin gray light across faces drawn tight with exhaustion, yet unbowed. The Creole, battered but afloat, had survived. So had the people aboard her. The storm revealed more than the ship's endurance. It revealed the unshakable core of those who had seized her. Fear had threatened to scatter them, but their resolve bound them together, stronger than any chains ever had. They were no longer mere passengers on a stolen vessel. They were a people united by a single, unyielding conviction. Freedom was worth every peril, every drop of sweat, every heartbeat. Days stretched into what felt like years, but eventually the horizon shifted. At first it was nothing more than a shadow, a darker smudge against the endless blue of the Atlantic. But as the Creole drew nearer, the shadow sharpened into form. Land. The Bahamas. For the 134 souls who had boarded the ship in chains, this was more than geography. It was salvation etched against the sky, a promise made real by courage and defiance. Yet the ocean was still merciless. Waves slammed against the hull like fists of a vengeful god. Rain poured in torrents, and the sky blackened with storm clouds. The Creole shuddered under the assault, as though the very waters sought to reclaim the vessel and the fragile hope it carried. Fear rippled among the freed men and women. Even the chained sailors muttered warnings of reefs, hidden currents, and death lurking in every swell. But Madison, standing tall amid the chaos, reminded them of all they had already endured. The wheel turning beneath the sailor's hands was no longer just wood and rope. It was history being forced onto a new course. "We did not seize this ship to lose our way," he whispered to himself, eyes fixed on the storm-dark horizon. "We will see land. We will see freedom." And so the Creole, once destined for New Orleans, now sailed into uncharted destiny. Her sails caught the wind, her keel carved a path through waves, and her passengers, no longer silent cargo, stood together as witnesses to a moment when captivity bent, however briefly, to the will of the human spirit. The words spread among them like a current running through the blood. Some fell to their knees, hands clasped in trembling prayer. Others pressed close to the railing, eyes wide, tears cutting through the salt on their cheeks. Children clung to their mothers, too young to understand politics or law, yet old enough to sense that something monumental was unfolding. To Madison Washington, the sight struck deeper than words could capture. He knew the Bahamas were under British rule, and he knew Britain had abolished slavery in 1834. The significance of that shoreline was not abstract. It was freedom made tangible, freedom embodied in the swaying palms and the turquoise waves. It meant that the gamble of mutiny might yield something far greater than a violent end. The sailors, still bound, exchanged uneasy glances. They understood the power of Nassau, the promise it represented. If the captives set foot there, American law could not claim them. Above, the United States flag snapped in the wind, a reminder of the authority they had defied, a banner of the world they had escaped. But beneath it, a new current surged, undeniable and alive, hope. As the Creole drew closer, the turquoise water shimmered beneath the sun, reflecting the green palms that lined the distant shore. They seemed to welcome those who had known nothing but fields and chains, their leaves bending gently as if bowing in acknowledgement of courage. The sight was almost unbearable in its beauty, yet fear lingered. What if Britain yielded to American demands? What if law tilted back toward chains? Freedom had not yet been fully grasped. It hovered just beyond the waves, waiting to be claimed or denied. Still, for the first time since boarding the Creole, the future felt possible. Not guaranteed, not safe, but possible, Madison whispered to those nearest him. "Look, that is the horizon we dreamed of. Whatever comes, we have reached this far. Hold it in your heart." And so they sailed into Nassau Harbor, the Creole heavy with history, their faces lit by the fragile, burning hope that the horizon promised. Nassau was no ordinary port. It was a crossroads of empires, a place where American merchants traded, British officials ruled, and ships from every corner of the Atlantic passed through. When the Creole dropped anchor, the rebellion it carried became more than an act of defiance. It became a question of law that would echo far beyond the Bahamas. American representatives demanded the return of their property. To them, the 134 men and women were cargo, stolen goods to be restored. They argued with the full weight of treaties and law, issuing threats, insisting that Nassau had no authority to interfere. But the British colonial government stood firm. Since 1834, slavery had been abolished throughout the empire. On British soil, no human being could be owned. And so the officials declared, in words that rang through the tense harbor, "Here there are no slaves. Here they are free." Inside the courtroom in Nassau, tension crackled like electricity. Sailors testified, merchants pleaded. Captives stood in silence, their fates balanced on the sharp edge of law and principle. The courtroom seemed to tremble, stretched between nations, between profit and justice. In the end, 128 of the captives were granted freedom. Only those accused of direct violence were held for further consideration. The rest were released. Chains fell away. Names once counted as inventory were spoken aloud again, tied only to life, not to commerce. The decision ignited outrage in the United States. Newspapers fumed. Slaveholders seethed at the loss of their so-called property. But in Nassau on that day, justice had bent toward freedom. For Madison Washington, it was vindication. The revolt had not been in vain. Every risk, every tremor of fear, every heartbeat of rebellion had led to this moment. Liberty made real, freedom earned through courage, resilience, and unyielding resolve. Vain, the whispers in the dark. The storm endured, the blood spilled. It had all led to this, a court recognizing their humanity. When the ruling was read, the room seemed to exhale. The captives, now truly free, embraced one another. Their tears were no longer of despair, but of release, of a weight finally lifted. For the first time, the word freedom was not a dream murmured in chains. It was a fact etched into law. The mutiny of the Creole had traveled from ship to shore. From violence to verdict, and history, once indifferent, had been forced to listen. The air in Nassau carried a weight unlike any they had breathed before. It was thick with heat, salt, and the voices of people walking freely along the docks. For the 128 released captives, stepping onto that soil felt like crossing an invisible threshold between nightmare and dawn. One by one, they descended from the Creole. Their feet touched the earth not as property but as people. Some dropped to their knees, pressing hands into the soil as though confirming its reality. Others lifted their faces to the sky, lips moving in long-denied prayers. Madison Washington stood among them, shoulders broad, eyes steady. He was neither king nor general, yet in that moment he carried the aura of both. The men and women gathered around him instinctively, as if his presence alone anchored the fragile reality of their freedom. Tears flowed freely, tears of exhaustion, grief for what had been lost, gratitude for what had been gained. The waves lapping against the harbor mingled with their sobs, forming a hymn of release written not in notes, but in breath. Children clung to their mothers, too young to understand laws or nations, but old enough to sense that the world had shifted. They no longer saw chains on their parents' wrists, no longer felt the iron weight of ownership. For the first time, they belonged only to themselves. Washington spoke little. His words had already been expressed in whispers, in shouts, and in the silent defiance of action. Now even his silence was eloquent. He simply gazed toward the horizon, as though searching for something beyond even this hard-won victory. His figure, firm and unwavering amid the freed, became a symbol. In him, they saw the embodiment of a truth long denied. Liberty was not a gift to be granted. It was a right to be claimed. The docks of Nassau had seen countless ships arrive and depart. But on that day, when 128 souls stepped into the sunlight as free people, the harbor became something more than a port. It became a stage upon which history declared itself quietly, solemnly, yet unmistakably. For those who lived it, that moment would echo in their hearts forever. The Creole Mutiny remains one of the most extraordinary and yet least remembered acts of defiance in American history. Unlike so many revolts that ended in blood and chains, this one ended in freedom. 128 men and women walking onto British soil as free human beings. Yet history has a way of silencing inconvenient victories. Madison Washington's name does not thunder across textbooks. The Creole is rarely spoken of with the same weight as battles, treaties, or political revolutions. Its story survives mostly in fragments, whispers, and the margins of memory. And yet, its meaning endures. The mutiny exposed the fault lines of nations. An America clinging to slavery, a Britain committed to abolition. It forced the world to confront the fragile morality of property over people. It proved in the most unyielding way that courage, conviction, and the unbreakable human spirit could bend the currents of history. The mutiny forced the world, if only briefly, to reckon with a question that law alone could not answer. Could human justice ever be denied what humanity made clear? For Madison Washington, the revolt was never about headlines, glory, or fame. It was about a principle larger than his own life, that freedom is worth risking everything. He had escaped once, only to be captured and shackled again. Yet still he rose, undaunted. His courage transformed a ship meant to deliver bodies into a vessel of liberation. The legacy of that act lies not solely in its outcome, but in the questions it leaves behind. Who defines a man? Is it the law that calls him property? Or is it history, which remembers him as a liberator? The Creole Mutiny whispers across time, urging us to remember that freedom has always been won by those willing to stand in defiance, even when the odds weigh like iron. And so we return to Madison Washington, a man born in chains who dared to dream beyond them. His story is not simply one of rebellion. It is a story of love. Love for his wife, for his people, and for the unshakable idea that no human being was ever meant to live as cargo.